So welcome everybody to Malware Analysis for Incident Response. My name is AJ. I will be your host for today. So today's talk, definitely we'll get to it. I just really want to say thank you so much to the B-Sides organizers. I can personally attest to how much effort goes into these conferences, having been a part of some of the development in previous years. And what you see is bookended by just an enormous amount of effort from everybody associated. Any volunteer that's here has put in considerable amounts of time. As you have no doubt seen already or heard, the CTF is like unbelievable. I mean, year over year, that consistently gets much better. And then compounding the fact that we have obviously a pandemic still in our midst. Doing this in a virtual environment definitely comes with its fair share of headaches. I like to maintain that everybody has a plan until 250 people log in all at once. And that's probably a little of what we were experiencing. So big thanks to everybody for the patience on that, but really, really big thank you to the B-Sides organizers. If you get the chance, please give them a shout out, let them know that they're doing excellent work. I genuinely appreciate it. The support is really excellent. And I hope you all get something out of it. So thanks for for attending. We're getting going on the biological malware version of B-Sides here. So let's get to it. So a little about me, some shameless self-promotion. There's another bit of letters over here somewhere. I just forgot to add them. I've been in the business for a little while now in many different capacities, previously consulting, internal operations, client-facing operations, spent some time as a QSA, a little everything, and definitely focusing the majority of my effort as of late in the incident response field. So I was a teacher in the ISS program at SAIT briefly. I was there for a couple semesters, and now I'm off to something else that I'm working on. So it's good. One of the big things I always noticed inside of organizations was that incident response definitely wasn't handled as effectively as it could be in some cases. And there's definitely a few reasons for that, but we're going to get to some of the way the incident response process is supposed to work. And you'll actually have an opportunity to sort of test some of these concepts a little later today and tomorrow. I'm giving an incident response tabletop workshop where we will be playing a game that I developed as well. So we're having an incident. It's in a game-like fashion, and it's going to be pretty interesting. So that's all the hints that I want to give to that. If you want to come check it out, be sure to do so. It's going to be a good time. So let's talk a little bit about the malware problems at first, what we're actually looking up against. I'm going to talk a bit about the IR process and how it's intended to play out and what an organization can do to sort of increase that. We'll discuss a few benefits of malware analysis. So what is the net positive to the organization for having somebody on staff who can conduct this work? I'll tell you a little bit about how to set up your labs. It won't be a very comprehensive lab setup. Reason being is the actual lab setup isn't overly difficult. So if you have any questions at the end of it, don't hesitate to ask. But I'll certainly talk you through that process. It is assuming you have some basic fundamentals in VMware, but that said, it's nothing I couldn't catch you up on in a hurry if we were doing LobbyCon afterwards. So don't worry about that. And then I will align the analysis efforts to the IR process so that you can start to piece together how you would use these artifacts in an incident response process and how to make your IR a little bit more effective. A few things to consider, and then I'll open the floor up for some Q&A or cut you free for some time back. So based on the Verizon data breach report, they had 509 reported malware incidents in there, at least in the stats that I was looking at. Of those, nearly 40% were attributed to password collection. As everybody is probably well aware, plenty of attackers usually seek to steal credentials, usually as a means of persistence or furthering their campaigns. So that's often targeted by a large portion of attackers for sure. Makes sense to weaponize that in a malware form if you can get to it. In addition to that, 25% of those were attributed to information theft. So simply collecting the data from the workstation, uploading it to a command and control server, and then moving on with the rest of their campaign. And of those, 20% were classified as ransomware. So the majority of us, I think at some point, whether we care to admit it or not, have worked through a ransomware incident. They certainly are no fun. They were definitely never my favorite things, but it's out there. It's happening a lot, and definitely given the remote nature of work and how some of these processes have likely changed, information security is very important, and a lot of organizations, I think, are going to start to run into problems here. One of the things I've noticed is when it comes to a malware outbreak, most organizations tend to rely on tools or capabilities that maybe are just a little bit inefficient or a little slow on the uptake. One of the commonalities I've seen across most companies is we're going to let AV do the scanning and hope that it returns something, usually as a first method of identification. That doesn't always work, especially if your antivirus hasn't heard of the sample that got loose in your environment, or if the signatures have changed, or if the models haven't been trained accordingly. So it's not a guarantee that your in-house tools are going to find it. The other thing to consider is malware is so publicly accessible. Many criminal organizations have gone corporate now. They have the ability to stand up a call center to give you the encryption key that they themselves use to encrypt your data. So as long as the payment clears, everything's good. So there's very low barriers to entry for anybody looking to start a malware campaign and make any money at it. The other side of it is companies have to pay a lot of money in malware incident response. Oftentimes the organization's down, critical parts of the business are down for extended periods of time. Just the pure labor hour cost can be insane, just because so many people have to be involved, usually in remediating the situation. From a pure labor standpoint, that gets very expensive. So there are definitely, it's not in the organization's favor in this case. The criminals definitely get the upper hand on this one. So it sort of behooves us to have a better process for finding some of this and being a little more effective in our response. So at a quick glance, IR breaks down into very distinct categories. You have your preparation phase. This is basically the precursor to an incident. This is, ideally you should be building the arc before the rain comes. This is all of the work that you would be doing to get your teams ready. So I'll touch on these in a few seconds here. From there, you have identification. So assuming an incident has been called and you have alerting and everything in place, at this point now it becomes about identifying all of the compromised assets inside of your organization so that you can effectively contain them. At this point, you're trying to stop the bleeding. That containment effort becomes very important, because if you miss something, you actually run into situations where that asset can continue to infect new ones. All of your various containment and eradication work tends to go out the window. So making sure that everything is segmented either physically or logically through some kind of control lists is very important. Again, we'll dig into those in just a few minutes. And then once you have all of that isolated and contained, you want to go ahead and eradicate the threat. So attackers maintain some kind of persistence on systems. That's just the way they operate. So you want to remove that persistence so that you can go ahead and recover safely without creating any kind of additional backdoors that you may or may not be aware of. So definitely spend the time to find all of the methods of persistence here. You never know. You think a device is ready to go, you bring it back on the network, and something that missed these first two goes ahead and reinfects that one that you just brought online. That definitely prolongs the length of your incident. Once you've eradicated everything, you now go through the recovery process, bringing the assets back online so that the business can resume. And then from there is lessons learned. This is actually pretty important. I do touch on this a little bit, but I cannot overstate how valuable this piece is to the IR process as well. So it might look like waterfall, the idea being that you go through each of these steps in order. In reality, it usually plays out a little more like agile, where you might find something, work to contain it early on, and then carry on back through your identification process. Each organization is a little bit different, and how they go about orchestrating this based on the assets affected, the team members they have, that's going to be unique to them. But in this case, you definitely want to at least follow these steps at a very conceptual level so that you're making sure you have understood the entire scope of the problem, you've contained everything effectively, you've removed any methods of persistence, you've brought the assets back online and thus the business, and then you go ahead and learn from it and implement any changes. You don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your lowest level of preparation. Chris Voss. This is he's a former FBI negotiator, lead negotiator for FBI counterterrorism, I think it was. He wrote a book, Never Split the Difference. Highly recommend this book. It's just really interesting reading. Has value not only if you are a hostage negotiator, which I think there's probably none of us in the room, but it actually has really interesting knowledge to gain from this. Highly recommend that book, but it's absolutely the case. When it comes to IR, the level of preparation you and your teams have is the best that you can deliver at that time. So the more prepared your team is, the more effective your response is. In that case, if you're using any tools to help you in the process, if you have any scripts, if there's any environments, if you're doing any kind of forensics or capture environments, or in the case of malware analysis, your malware analysis environment, you really want to make sure that those are operational and working before an incident happens. In the midst of an incident is not the time to troubleshoot why a tool isn't working. Depending on what it does, you may want to try and use something else if you can, or have some clear documentation. Another thing that I found with a lot of incident response is communication. You absolutely need those clear communication pathways. You want to have physical phone trees, phone numbers, because SharePoint goes down. What if your SharePoint was one of the assets that got compromised and now it's offline? If all of your documentation lives there and it's important for you to have that in an incident, that needs to be available somewhere. So in that case, you want to make sure that you have some additional information available for your teams so that if something does go down that they are relying on, that isn't what hangs up the rest of your incident progress. Similarly, if your attacker has breached your VoIP or email environments, you definitely want to have some kind of out-of-band communication. Right? Make sure that you have some additional phones or some separate phones. I once worked in an organization, they called it the bat phone. It's just a small handful of flip phones that they used in the event the VoIP system went down so that the environment could stay online. So that worked very well. You definitely want to make sure you have some method of staying in touch with your incident response teams. You also have to validate that any equipment is in good working order. So if you are doing forensic imaging, if you are doing malware analysis or any other kind of technical involvement, you want to make sure that is working as much as you can beforehand. You want to be able to restore that quickly if something goes down. And especially in the context of malware analysis, you do need to be able to restore fast in the event that you have infected your system, because you will willingly infect your system for the purpose of analysis. So I'll get to that in a second. And have a clean shirt. Incidents take a long time. Make sure that hygiene is a thing. It definitely doesn't take long for a conference room to gather a bit of a funk. So, just show up in clean clothes. Your colleagues will appreciate that. So let's say we have an incident. We've declared that, based on the indicators that we've seen and the alerts that we've observed, or the behavior that we've observed, that, okay, there has been intent to do harm here. A system has been compromised. It is now time for us to start working the identification process. So with regards to malware, there's definitely a few places you can look. Indicators of compromise will show up in your log data. If you are monitoring traffic, if you have like a network tap or some kind of PCAP going on, some kind of packet capturing, those files usually have some pretty interesting content in it if you can acquire it. This is a little bit rare in a lot of organizations unless they're purposefully capturing that network monitoring. It doesn't take long for this to get noisy and tough to sift through, so this might not be available to you all the time. But if you have a known infected system and you have the ability to capture packets and watch what's happening across the wire, this can help you out quite a bit. Tons of malware does live in the registry. Specifically, fileless malware will actually load itself right into a Windows registry almost in every step that it can. So paying attention to registry integrity monitoring, again, this isn't always a proactive approach that organizations have. The overhead on it, I imagine, would be quite immense. But in your analysis environment, you can actually leverage this quite well. So the way that works is you have a registry monitoring tool. You take a snapshot of it in a clean state, you run your sample, you take a second snapshot, compare the difference, and then at that point, you now have some registry indicators that you can start to sift through inside of the organization as a whole. If you have file integrity monitoring running, there may be some alerts that get generated if a specific file is trying to be accessed, in which case you could monitor that tool for any of those file accesses. If something is trying to write to a file, same idea. If it's monitoring for that integrity changes, you might be able to pick that up inside of your environment. Again, FIM is notoriously noisy. There are no shortage of organizations that have it in place, and it tends to alert on everything except what you're actually looking for. So your mileage may vary if you have FIM installations, but it's always worth a shot. I mentioned antivirus earlier on. If you do have endpoint AV, I don't think I've ever encountered a single organization that didn't have some kind of endpoint antivirus running on it. That's a good step. That's definitely something valuable. The big problem with antivirus is if the signature is not in the threat intelligence database and it doesn't catch the behavior as it's running, you may not get an indicator from your endpoint tools that there's actually a problem on the device. So you don't want to rely on it as much as you might think you'd want to, because it can be bypassed. We hear about AV bypasses all the time, and that's just the reality of the situation we're in. So leverage your AV as much as you can, but in this case, consider it a bit of a trust but verify situation. And of course, any traffic monitoring. So if you have, again, network layer monitoring, if you have any firewall logging going on, any of that information, all of that can help you in the analysis process. If you don't have any of that and you're in the middle of an incident with this analysis process, you could potentially derive some logs that you should turn on and start to pay attention to, which can definitely help out. Logging is super helpful. It's more helpful if it's in place before the infection. So when I mentioned preparation, one of the things you may want to consider doing if you don't already, have some logging in place on some critical assets or some of your outbound connections where a malicious file would now have to pass through in order to call out. So firewalls, proxy logs, if you have them. Definitely something is better than nothing. Just get something going if you can, because that definitely makes your life a lot easier. On the fly, if you're in the middle of an incident and you do need to get some logging stood up, there are options for you to do that, but you'll want to have practiced that before an incident happens. I can tell you setting up logging in a hurry is a really difficult thing to do. So, that's just something to be careful of. The main goal, the main outcome is identify as much of the scope of compromise as you possibly can. The idea here is you want a tally of all of the assets that have been hit by this sample so that you can properly contain them and start to work the incident. So when we talk containment, we are effectively removing the assets from the network. You can physically disconnect these if they are physical assets. Those are becoming fewer and further between as we migrate to cloud. But there are some out there. So if you have desktop servers, anything that you do have a physical access to, you can just yank the cable and that should get you there. You can segment them into their own quarantine VLAN. Supremely common, works really well. And then it gives you the opportunity to keep all that data inside of one specific area, make it so that it can't connect outbound to any of your production or sensitive environments. And then it gets you in a position where you can, use some additional console connections to either get in and start to work the eradication steps, or at least leave them segmented out of the network so that they're not causing you any more pain. Similarly, if you have any internal firewalls or any layer 3, you can use ACLs. So access control lists will prevent that connection from coming out. The nice thing is with most firewalls, they do log whenever an ACL has been triggered. So now you can actually see if a specific device has been compromised because it's trying to phone out to a known C2 or a C2 endpoint that you've identified through your analysis. You definitely want to avoid powering down if you can. Reason being is not every organization wants to sign on for a full forensic analysis consultant. Usually it's somebody who comes in independently if you don't have it in-house. It becomes a very expensive engagement. And if you don't have a lot of the really important artifacts lined up ahead of time, it might just be a very expensive investigation that may not get you any further. That said, if there is a desire to have forensics come on site and do some work, definitely make sure those systems are up and running. You don't want to power them down. There's a lot of excellent volatile data that lives in RAM, and you more than likely will lose it as soon as you power it down. And then any of the really interesting infections or some of the maybe persistent connections that would be there get lost. So avoid powering these down if at all possible. Ultimately, what you want from containment, you want all of your infected systems to be adequately socially distanced from all of your non-affected systems. You don't want to create a bigger problem than you have to solve. It definitely compounds the issue if you have your infected assets on the same network as your production ones and they're now reinfecting new systems. That makes for a really long night. However, disconnecting these boxes will almost entirely cause an outage of services. It's very rare that they wouldn't, unless it's somehow a system that isn't necessarily used for anything of any importance. So you will almost always need some kind of sign off from data ownership or the business itself. This can be difficult to get when you are in the throes of an incident. I was once working an incident where it was 3 o'clock on a Wednesday and we couldn't get sign off from the business to take down the server because it was still working. So they said, nope, we just want to keep this going. We'll come back to this a little later. That's a very real conversation that you may have, and it might be frustrating, but the business will win every time. Just be ready for that. Not a bad thing. That's just the way it is. So once we've gone ahead and contained everything, it's time to get rid of any of the persistence and threat actor presence. So there's a few ways that attackers, specifically in a malware event, will maintain compromise. Scheduled tasks and cron jobs, that's often overlooked. Many administrators will look past the scheduled tasks. There's tons of them that do show up in Windows by default. So it is important to have at least an understanding of which ones are authorized, which ones are not, so that you can go ahead and find them. Obviously, attackers with password dumping capabilities will try and compromise those credentials. Assume whatever system they were on, that SAM database is probably, the credentials within it are probably compromised. So definitely make it a part of your containment eradication efforts to disable those accounts or reset those passwords so that whoever is authorized to actually hold those accounts can come back and use it. Registry modifications, as I mentioned, fileless malware lives in the registry. Lots of malicious samples will also dig into the registry as a means of persistence. So just because you have cleared the file and stopped the traffic doesn't necessarily mean that you've actually eradicated the threat. There might be some registry hooks in there that now come back. When the system reboots, there's your malware all over again. Similarly, with the account credential theft, if they have administrator level credentials that they've compromised, your attacker might create some new ones, whether they do it by hand or whether they do it through a malicious sample that they now pass back through C2. Whatever that looks like, new accounts may be created, and they definitely look for that administrative level. So you want to go through all of your admin accounts at the very least as part of your containment and eradication exercises to make sure that everyone that's there is supposed to be there, so authorized by the business, and that the levels of permissions are what they're expected. Any ones that aren't what you're expecting, or if it's just kind of a suspicious one, your best bet is to disable it and then wait until somebody comes either saying my account doesn't work or follow up, because administrator accounts can run roughshod over your network. One of the most common methods that you'll find malware leverages persistence is simply dropping files on the system. Some of the examples I'm about to show you, they drop files. They reach out to a C2 server, it downloads the payload onto the workstation itself or the endpoint, and then leaves it there in a file buried somewhere that nobody's going to look for. And unless you actually know what to look for by name and by file path, finding those on your own can be notoriously difficult, even in very, very small environments. It really doesn't take much to hide a file inside of an operating system. Similarly, you'll find some malware creates a service. So one of the things you should be doing as part of your preparation is baselining services on your environment if you can. That definitely takes a lot of effort administratively. So maybe hire an intern or something if you're trying to do it on a budget. But you definitely want to go into these systems and understand what services are supposed to be there, those applications and what they're doing, so that if a new service spins up all of a sudden, you know that that's probably an infected system and it's time for you to start working that process. Alternate data streams, for anybody who hasn't seen these are processes that actually contain some hidden data behind them inside the process itself. So finding these alternate data streams, I have to look the syntax up every single time. I rarely ever do it. But you would be surprised at how many systems, benign processes on your system, are running some kind of alternate data stream. One of the things you want to look for inside of an endpoint is these alternate data streams. Is there any additional calling out that you might have missed? Is there anything that might be hidden inside of the payload itself? Whatever you can do to find this is definitely in your best interest. You want to be thorough. This is an important step, because if you miss something, you bring it back online, your incident starts all the way over again. And in a lot of cases, you might accidentally tip off your attacker that you're onto them if you've gotten this far. So they'll now either ramp up their attack or change their methods, and then you're pretty much back to square one again. So you definitely want to take some time and validate that you caught everything at this stage if you can. And recovery. Now it's time to bring the business back online. So we've gone through and identified all of the systems that have been compromised. We've contained them into their own separate environment. We've found all of the threat actors, methods of persistence. We've cleared them out. Now it's time to bring the servers, systems, endpoints, what have you, back online. So if the malware that you were experiencing in your environment made use of a vulnerability, you want to patch that if you can. Make sure you patch it before you bring it online. And it isn't enough just to install the patch. You need to validate that the patch is effective. A few ways you can do this. You can vulnerability scan with an automated tool like Nessus inside your environment. That will go ahead and usually tell you if there's a vuln present or something else you need to address. But if you don't have anything like that, you may need to do some digging at the endpoint level just to make sure that the vulnerable condition has been fixed before you do anything else. If you have any missing data or compromised data or encrypted data, go ahead and reload that back into these systems now, as long as your backups are solid. And there was actually one incident I remember where the malware was backed up with the backups for a considerable amount of time, so much so that it resulted in quite a bit of data loss. So you definitely want to, as part of the preparation efforts, you want to test your system backups regularly, make sure that they are intact, that they are known secure, because if you have to restore that data, you want to do it not only as quickly as possible, but as effectively as possible, because large-scale data loss, depending on the scope of that data and what you're required to disclose, could be bad. So you definitely want to make sure as part of your prep that your backups are solid and malware-free. Any services that you've turned off, whether it be for troubleshooting or investigation, turn those back on. Make sure you're paying close attention to application dependencies. Some services may need to be started up in a specific order. So if you have a business critical app that needs to run in a specific way, make sure it's documented so that all of your administrators can go ahead, turn this back up nice and quick, and bring the business back online with any new setups they have to do. If you aren't backing up configurations to critical systems, might be a good idea to start doing that at some point soon. Some configurations are long and unwieldy. You want to be able to bring those back very quickly as well. Malware can often get into some of these files and either create backdoors through that, depending on the permissions they have available to them, or simply just corrupt them entirely. So you want to make sure that your configurations can come back as intended. Otherwise, if you do it incorrectly, you might introduce some new vulnerabilities that all of a sudden now have to get dealt with if somebody gets there first. Any security tools, AV is another common one that shows up here. AV might be missing signatures. You might have an agent that's out of date. You want to make sure that that's up to date before the system comes back online. If you have any security controls in your environment, you want to make sure that those survived as well, because a lot of malware, at least at the endpoint level, will try and stop those or corrupt them in some capacity. So if you're using an endpoint AV and the agent is out of date, make sure you go ahead and install that if you can. But again, paying very close attention to dependencies, because there have been stories of malware endpoint updates where it broke something critical on the system. I'm sure everybody has a story about that at some point. Last and certainly not least, whoever owns the data in the environment, whatever business unit is in charge of that, sorry, brief cat-based interruption. You want to acquire sign-off that stipulates that the data is intact, the system is properly configured, everything is online as expected. Ultimately, the data ownership is the one that signs off on this. So somebody with that authority can go ahead and do that once they've had a chance to review it. So don't skip on this step. This is important. It might seem onerous, and whoever might have to pick up the phone and validate that in the middle of the night might not be overly pleased. Your sort of get out of jail free card is, I just want to make sure the business is working before business hours tomorrow morning. That's a really hard one to get upset about. If anybody does get upset with you about that, they can fight me in real life. I'll take that on for you. So lessons learned. This is, like I said, a very important meeting. This is where some of the new business decisions happen. So you want to make sure you attend this if you work the incident, if you can. The way this works, if you were the incident responder presenting what happened, you just want to present the facts of the incident. Let the facts stand out on their own. You don't necessarily want to throw anyone or any process or anything under the bus. That's definitely not a good thing. To sort of paraphrase, shit happens, right? Like, things are going to happen in any corporate environment. Malware happens, even to the most well-intentioned people. So just present the facts of what happened, let them speak for themselves. You want to identify any of the affected assets. Reason being is somebody in the seats of management inside of your organization might not be aware of how involved this incident may have been. So if the assets that were affected were really high value or of a particular critical nature, that can sometimes get really good attention to all of a sudden find budget for your new changes that you're trying to propose. If you have evidence confirming that compromise, make sure it gets in there. Screenshots and visual evidence are always good. The recommendations, that is such an important component as well. Quite often overlooked, but really, really critical. Reason being is, one of the questions you're going to get in these meetings is, how do we avoid this next time? You want to preempt that entirely by discussing the recommendations. Create a business case for each one, and specifically evaluate the cost of control versus the cost of doing nothing, if time permits. Reason being is, establishing that business case will not only help you get budget in a place where you really didn't think it would show up, but it also helps to understand the value of a security program inside of an organization. So that's the IR process in a shell. Let's talk a little about malware analysis. So with good malware analysis, you can usually uncover some kind of indicator of compromise that you can use to accelerate the identification process. So remember when I mentioned that if you're trying to just mine through a bunch of data, or you're trying to look through your AV, that can take quite a bit of time. If you're leveraging some malware analysis efforts, you actually have this ability to sort of expedite that process. In a lot of cases, you might be able to find some level of C2 identification, so some kind of C2 endpoint that you can use to start hunting down affected assets. So the reason why I mentioned things like proxy logs and firewall logs, if anything had to transit through those assets at any point, you now have the necessary information to find out if something is malicious or if it has been affected. If there's any persistence mechanisms during your analysis effort, you might be able to uncover those. So watching your analysis machine for all of the usual places, your tasks, any cron jobs if you're doing anything in a Unix environment, services that get spun up, processes that get created, all of that information can start to show up in your analysis pretty quickly, and it will often work faster than your antivirus tools can. So again, saving lots of time, more effective IR, that's the goal here. And incidentally, if you, some information stealing malware, depending on how well you can reverse engineer this, you might be in a position to see the type of data that it's targeting, which now becomes a really excellent phone call to anybody who has to go ahead and disclose this. So for anybody in a PCI space, you might have breach disclosure requirements with the various card brands. Depending on where your business operates, you might have mandatory breach disclosure laws. Depending on the type of data that's compromised, you might have mandatory breach disclosure as well. So having an understanding of what data was sought and potentially compromised helps you start to navigate that process nice and early. A few drawbacks to malware analysis. It can be time consuming. The long and short of the malware that's out there is designed to trick you. Malware authors will write all kinds of little red herrings and rabbit holes for you to fall down purposefully to waste your time. Some of them might actually go so far as to further infect your system, try to break out of your analysis environment. So you have to be careful. It is time consuming. It can be very easy to be led astray. Malware analysis is a very niche skill. It doesn't come with a lot of SOC offerings, and it doesn't necessarily find itself inside a lot of organizations. That said, it is something you can cultivate on your own. You can practice it internally in your own environment with very, very specific segmentation and setup environments, which I'll get to in just a second. And of course, nobody ever wants to make the incident worse. If you are the malware analyst and you haven't taken steps to segment your environment properly, you are about to make the incident just a whole lot worse. So you definitely want to avoid getting wrapped up in that and becoming your own liability if you can. So your analysis environment, as much as segmentation is an option inside of an organization for whatever reason, it is not an option for malware analysis. You are obligated to segment your environment. You can do this a few ways. You can do it through some VLAN segmentation if you have some purpose-built infrastructure. If you have some spare hosts hanging around that you can afford to air gap and console in with a separate monitor and keyboard, that's also an option. The host-only route, if you're running VMs on a laptop, works just fine as well. Just keeping in mind that the endpoint host that you are working with, or sorry, your laptop, you want to make sure that there's no business critical data on that. You want to make sure that it isn't likely to cause further infection. You want to disconnect that as much as you can. Or any of the above. If you have some spare infrastructure and somebody who's willing to set it up for you in a specific manner, you can actually go ahead and set up a pretty awesome malware lab without a ton of extra work. So if you have an isolated network that you can leverage inside of your organization, that definitely opens up a few doors for you for sure. You need to be able to quickly restore your environment. So what I mean by that is, if you will infect systems, this is the deal. You are purposefully infecting endpoints that you control, that you're capturing the events specifically to find whether or not there has been a problem. You definitely want to make sure that you can quickly restore that. Reason being is if you can't and you have to rebuild it, you're now taking more time at a point in the incident where you probably can't afford to. So quick and easy restoration definitely is good. Snapshots for virtual machines make this way, way easy. So feel free to use that. That works really well. And make sure that all of your tools on your systems are set up. There's a few dependencies for a lot of tools, and I'm about to get to that with my preferred setup. But all of your tools should be up and running, set up, configured, tested, validated before your samples even go on there for testing. So make sure that your snapshots are up to date, test that regularly, and away you go. So my preferred configuration, it's not the only way to do it, but this is the way I like to do it. It helps keep things mobile. So if I have to go to a remote site, I can still do this work. If I have to stay in some other remote situation, it still works. I can take it with me wherever I want. I can load it into my lab environment very easily. I can build it out of my lab environment, any of that information, all that's good. So my preferred configuration is I like a small amount of purpose-built infrastructure. If I'm mobile, if I have to go to a client site, I'll bring it on a laptop. That laptop has VMware configured and installed, ready to go. My operating system that hosts everything is fully patched and up to date. Shields up, Windows Firewall is up and running. Data that's on it is perfectly disposable. Whatever's on it, I could afford to just leave on the ground and it wouldn't be a problem. I treat that underlying host as something I could potentially throw away if I ever needed to. Inside of those VM environments, you want one Windows-based VM for Windows-based malware, as you might imagine. There are no shortage of tools that run on Windows for malware analysis, lots of them open source, really excellent options out there for sure. You want a Linux-based VM for some of that analysis and some of that traffic handling. So I use Remnux. Remnux does work very well. It's free. It's built on a live CD, so you can just quickly reboot it, and it comes back to a bare configuration. There's lots of excellent services that run on it that you can use to impersonate C2 handling so that your malware has somewhere to talk to, and then you can see some of that chain go back and forth. So with that configuration, your Windows VM should only be able to communicate to your Linux VM. So the Linux VM is the one that isn't accepting all of the traffic requests, all of the data, and just sending it back to your infected host, whatever it's supposed to look like. So Remnux has a tool on it called INetSim. It's an internet simulator. It simulates a bunch of different protocols, ports, services that you can now use. So if you have a malware sample that runs over IRC, for instance, you can set up an IRC listener for any of the commands that are going to be coming across from your infected machine into your C2 handling. It doesn't pass back what the malware might be looking for unless you know what to look for. But for an initial triage and investigation effort, it works really, really well. You also get nice bits of logging, so you can see if you're using, if your malware is using HTTP or DNS, you can see those logs coming across. So if it's actually requesting something different, or if that endpoint is encrypted or obfuscated, that would get unpacked when the sample runs. You'd be able to see that on your listener. So that has immense value, putting that VM into that listen mode. You make it so that your Windows VM can only communicate to your Remnux VM, not anywhere else. So if you have old hardware hanging around, it can be done pretty easily. I mean, VMware practically runs on anything nowadays. VirtualBox will also take up this work nice and easily. But I did find that the networking connections, getting some of those network connections to talk back and forth as intended, did seem to fall down a bit more with VirtualBox than it did through VMware. And if you're using Hyper-V, I welcome all 10 of you who might be doing that. That's totally cool too. Whatever virtualization software you choose to use is entirely fine. Just make sure that you have the ability to quickly restore your environment, effectively segment it from the rest of your network, running on hosts that you really don't care if they get infected or not, that you can also quickly restore. Again, you're handling live malware, so you have to treat it as though it's live malware. Your Windows configuration, there's a few extra steps you have to make sure of to get everything talking. You need to configure your IP and DNS settings inside of your network adapter. Make it so that the next hop is just your Remnux machine, nothing else. So your default gateway is your Remnux host, and your DNS is your Remnux host as well. Those two things will now serve up the requests back to you. In that case, yeah, Steve, yeah, too funny, Steve Porter. Good to see you. That configuration, that connection is super important, because your machine needs to think it's connected to the internet. A lot of malware looks for disconnected network interface cards or the inability to reach out to something, and might actually shut itself down as a precautionary measure. If you have your Remnux machine up and running, it is serving up requests, you can actually go ahead and replicate some of this and get that working. The tools that you need to have, everybody's going to be a little different. This is just where it starts to come from practice and just feeling away your own systems here. At a minimum, you need some kind of file header analysis tool. You need to be able to look at the PE headers, PE Explorer, CFF Explorer, PE ID. There's lots of them out there. You need a strings analysis tool for finding initial strings. So one of the first bits of evidence I'm going to show you is just simply strings. What strings do we see in the clear text? Even if malware is packed and obfuscated, you still get some clear text information. If there is an encryption scenario where it either has to reach out for a key exchange or reach out for some command to go ahead and encrypt, you might actually get an address that it has to go through first. Super, super helpful. You'll need some hex editors just to go ahead and validate any of the hex information that might be in there. Ghidra is definitely a free and useful tool. And then you have TCP dump. Holy cow, I have 5 minutes. Oh, my bad. Okay, well, we're going to speed through this. So this is what it looks like when your connections are up and running. Google actually didn't respond with this. It just showed up in my DNS logs here. So that's what that looks like. Any questions on that? I'm happy to answer. Never ever connect your systems to the internet unless you really need to. One of the things that you want to be careful of is if you do connect it to the internet, you might go ahead and make things worse, but there might be a specific point where you really just want to get that file that comes back down from the attacker. This is at your discretion and with an overabundance of caution. If you're never sure that you should connect to the internet, don't. Make sure that your Java and Python installs are up and running. Ghidra specifically runs on Java. Other tools might live on Python. Other tools might have some other capabilities. Any of those dependencies need to be in and running and up to date before you go ahead and put your samples on. Trying to connect to the internet to download these binaries after the fact definitely is going to be a headache you don't need. Make sure you're snapshotting your systems before you infect them or save your backup somewhere, and then test that restore. Put in all your installs, snapshot, revert back to snapshot, confirm everything still works, and then carry on. You want a plan. What I mentioned before is malware authors will try and confuse you. They will intentionally create red herrings for you to get lost into. Have a plan, jot down those desired outcomes, stick to it, but also know when it's, okay, I have enough, it's time to pull the ripcord and we're out of here. So you definitely want to find some very specific indicators of compromise, some ones that really make your life easier. C2 endpoints, especially if you're monitoring firewall traffic, files dropped if you're paying attention to any servers or desktops and any kind of file infections that might happen. If you do have the ability to find the registry entries and query them effectively throughout the rest of your organization, that's a good way to do it. Otherwise, that can definitely be a bit of a hill to climb. So judge accordingly based on the time you have, and also look for very specific processes or services that get created. Some malware will reach out, get some commands, create a new service or a new process that's different from the one that you've seen. You want to be able to catch that. So that definitely takes some time. The more that you can dig in and reverse engineer, the more specific your searches become, the less time you spend here. But you need to identify a stopping point. As I mentioned before, tons of malware is designed to be confusing and misleading. The actors will take great pains to encrypt or obfuscate the really important elements of it, the really infectious pieces of it. So if you can't unpack those for static analysis, then you just move on. That's your best way to do it. Definitely confirm segmentation before you get digging into it. Again, if you cause problems for your incident, it looks bad for you. So static analysis, you're not actually analyzing the malware with execution. It's just looking around in a static fashion. You can find useful artifacts very early on, usually some unique strings, some initial library imports, any file droppers if there's there, and anything else worth noting. Malformed user agent headers, you're going to see this quite a bit because if you have a misspelled user agent header, Mozilla with one L instead of two, that's a unique signature you can start to pivot on. So definitely start to keep going with that. The static analysis takes time, but it's worth it, I promise. So here's an example. This is strings analysis. This is one tool with one command line that I just tailed out to an endpoint, and it actually found very quickly that it does some imports. We have a file drop here, and then we see that it goes out to URL files to download, and thanks to practical malware analysis for the really excellent malware, this is where it went, right? When we open this up in a PE header tool set, we can see very clearly we have an executable in the resources header. This, if you haven't seen it before, all .exes have this program cannot be run in DOS mode. Finding this at the very top of your executable, totally normal. Finding it in the middle of your executable, highly suspect. And in fact, this lives inside of the resources section. So it's actually a program within a program. This is more than likely the malicious program itself. Static analysis, the whole step, each of these 3 steps, maybe 5 minutes at the most. It really was very quick. So now we have enough information. We can go to our firewall teams and say, I want to know if anybody made post or get requests to this address. Now we can also go to the server teams and say, I want to know if this executable is anywhere in the environment. Anything after the fact, I just need to know if there's an updater.exe. I'm also looking for this winup.exe. Go see if any of that lives anywhere. By the way, here's a potential file path you can start to look through. Those are 3 solid indicators that you can now ferret out to the rest of your teams while you continue to dig in with dynamic analysis. In this case, you are executing the payload on your systems. You need to have network packet monitoring, registry change monitoring, process monitoring, and log monitoring. You want to see as much of this happen as possible. Similarly, if you run into a packed and obfuscated binary, you may actually hit the limit of what you can unpack in that time. Dynamic analysis unpacks the sample in memory, allows it to run completely, and allows you to observe that traffic. So when we actually have all of our listeners up and running, this is the Remnux side. So it made a request to that endpoint, and it was talking just to my Remnux box. Makes perfect sense. This is the request. So if we're looking at proxy logs, we want to see GET requests of anybody who went to this. That means they probably got this file. Here's that file in the path. We saw the file get written to disk. Here's the other one we were looking for, that wupdate mgr. There it is in our syswow 64. And when we actually execute that, it pops up this little screen right here. So these are all rock solid indicators that you can use to confirm if an endpoint has been infected. All of your firewall logs, if you are paying attention to those, or any web proxy logs, should show a connection that went out to this. Those devices are known infected. Treat them as infected, quarantine them accordingly, go ahead, restore whatever you have to do after that point. This now gives you some opportunities to start digging in. We see one method of persistence, we see two methods of persistence, and from there, now we can start to dig in even further with registry monitoring if we have the time. Additional file integrity monitoring. You can actually start to work this file up in the same method, the same functions and process to see if this actually has any further indicators that you can use, if this gets deployed at any time. Now you have more to work with. The really nice thing is anybody who's pestering you for updates now has enough to keep them busy for a while. Which leads me to reporting findings. Note down your findings. Pay attention to how they came up when you ran them. So was it under certain conditions? Was it when you ran the file as administrator or as a general user? Make sure you're validating that and paying close attention to it. As soon as you have findings, escalate them to the right teams. Anything network-based needs to go to network management, server needs to go to server management, etc. Do this fast. Don't wait. Don't sit on this as a report. Treat this as critical information that has to get there now, because effective communication is vital. You need to describe what you found and why this matters to somebody who's paying attention to it. Have that ask, hey, go look for this file. If you see it, quarantine this host. It's known infected, and let's carry on. Don't sit on good information just because you're worried about putting your hand up. So a few things to consider. Static and dynamic analysis, absolutely mandatory. No way around it. If you can't figure out where to start, or if your static analysis is coming up short, move to dynamic analysis. The way it works is you start big with your filters, give me all of the events, and you start to whittle them down until you get to where you're supposed to go. So you might have to restore and reload filters just to see what that is. That takes practice, but it happens pretty quick. From start to finish for all those artifacts, I think was about 20 minutes. In my living room. So really fast, way faster than any endpoint AV is going to find, probably way more effective too. But time is limited. Don't go so fast that you're going to miss something, but you have to make sure that you're moving because incidents take a long time to clean up, usually many hours, many nights, sometimes weeks and months, depending on the scope of the incident and what was affected. So go fast, but not so fast that you miss anything. Always be segmented. Always make sure that your environment is well isolated from the rest of the network, that you cannot cause any further issues. Okay, so sorry to have to speed through the last half of that. I guess I like to hear myself talk. That's a first. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I know that there's later sessions. If you have any and you want to go to those and you want to circle back with me, I will be online for the majority of the day. I do have the IR tabletop talk coming. So we are playing a game that I did build that does replicate an incident in all of its interesting and hilarious glory. You can come and test some of this out. I think we might have a malware outbreak later on this afternoon. So good opportunity to test some of that. Love hearing from everybody. I'm going to leave this now. Thank you so much for coming. Wonderful to see you. Go B-Sides. Have a good rest of your con, everybody. Thank you. Oh yeah, I can get slides and stuff up. I don't know if there's like a talk repository or where the recordings are going to be, but yeah, wherever that winds up, B-Sides organizers, if you could just let me know, and I'll make sure it gets on there. Yeah, thanks everybody. It was good having you. Like I said, I'll stick around if anybody has any questions. It also looks like Michael is giving his talk here in a few minutes on mental health in information security. Yeah, +1. If you that's a struggle that everybody has. I don't care who you are. Go to that talk if you have any questions about it. That's going to be good. Actually, I think I'm going to attend that one as well. That'll be really good. Yes, I will make sure slides get somewhere. I don't know where that looks like yet. If anybody from B-Sides has any insight on where that might be, let me know. If not, just hit me up on LinkedIn or something. I'll make sure you get them. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Yes, Jeremy, it's the IR tabletop workshop. So I take the first few minutes, I describe tabletops, why they're important. I give you a few minutes to go get a coffee and decide which team you want to play on. And then we play for the rest of the afternoon. So understanding assembly is mandatory for malware analysis. Good question, Jason. No, it's not necessarily mandatory to do it in this capacity. If you want to just be good at it for the sake of incident response, for shortening the amount of time you spend on an IR situation in your organization, understanding assembly probably has a few diminishing returns. That said, if you are looking to do more along the lines of reverse engineering or more in-depth malware analysis, you definitely do need to understand some semblance of assembly. That said, Ghidra has the ability to take that assembly and derive it back to original source code pretty quickly. So whether that actually negates the need for assembly or not is probably open to interpretation. I found that the code, the decompiling there that came from the assembly was pretty accurate within Ghidra. So that suited me just fine, but it's personal preference. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, is there anything in Calgary that you would recommend? So shameless plug for the malware analysis course I used to teach at SAIT. They do have a malware analysis class inside the program where you do cover a considerable amount of ground in this space, more from a reverse engineering perspective rather than an IR perspective. But that's definitely the way to do it. Other than that, nothing in Calgary specifically, but Tyler Hudak has a course on Pluralsight, and he actually taught me malware analysis when I was at DerbyCon a few years ago. So that is a really excellent option as well. Pluralsight, most organizations have free or nearly free deals for Pluralsight, so they have good courses on there, malware analysis being one of them. Other than that, the Practical Malware Analysis book, really, really highly recommend it. Comes with tons of companion malware, excellent labs, tons of excellent learning. It's about $60 on Amazon. It's one with the alien autopsy. That's a good book. So if you're interested in digging in further, Jeremy, pick that one up for sure. Which tools would you recommend for malware analysis, Ghidra or IDA Pro, and why? Yeah, good question. Tools are subjective. What you choose to use as your tool obviously is up to you. It's whatever you're comfortable with. I personally prefer Ghidra for a few reasons. One, it's free. So you don't need to come up with a really compelling business case to use it. Whereas with IDA Pro, you need a very compelling business case to use it because it is quite expensive. The interface I find in Ghidra is just a little bit easier to navigate. I found getting around it a lot easier. I did like the auto decompilation kind of on the side of it. So you have all of the disassembled code showing up in the middle of your view. And then just off to the right, you have all of the code that comes as a result of it. So that really made it nice to sort of trace instructions, figure out what functions we're doing, and work from there from a reverse engineering standpoint. When it comes to tools, you want to have more than just the one. You don't want to rely on a single tool because tools are fallible. You can have two answers for the exact same sample of malware from two different tools. So the majority of the time you spend is just validating that your results were as expected or as intended. So as far as disassembling and decompilers go, Ghidra for sure. The free nature of it and the user friendliness is too much to ignore. Yeah, you're welcome, Jeremy. Anytime. Good stuff. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we can drop off the track here. I am still online through B-Sides. You can just hit me up through DMs, whatever else. And I think I'll take a cruise through some of the other cool stuff that's going on here, check out some talks. Really awesome lineup. Thanks again so much for all of the attendance, the B-Sides organizers. Again, thank you so much. I know how much work goes into this, and I cannot thank you enough for all of the effort that went into it. So great stuff. Enjoy the con, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.